Hey, good morning, everyone. It is good to be with you again this morning. Thanks for joining us. For you regular church family, it is awesome to be with you guys. For you guys joining for a first time, or if you're new, really want to welcome you guys here. Before we get going, I want to give a big shout out to my little man, Beckett, who is turning 5 today. And so Beckett, I know you're watching and you're going to fall asleep real shortly as Daddy talks here. So before you go to bed, happy birthday, buddy. Looking forward to coming to party with you right after. So we are in part 3 of our quarantine conversations, and I've invited my friend Jason Dykstra to be with us here this morning. If you guys have missed the first 2, let me give you a real quick recap. We decided to have these conversations because we are in lockdown again. And there's a lot of different questions. There's a lot of different information out there. And so it kind of started out with a conversation I wanted to have with Michael Cron about how does the church respond to this? The Elmer area specifically, we've come under quite a bit of heat because of a very outspoken church that has some very outspoken opinions on the way things should be. And so we had come under quite a bit of pressure to kind of like, how is the church responding? What does this look like? And so Michael and I started week 1 talking about what does it look like to live during these COVID regulations, especially if you disagree with the government. What are the things okay? Like how do you have civil disobedience and stay civil? What are the churches doing? And then also Michael talked a lot about not focusing so much on what we can't do, but focusing on what we can do. And especially going back into this lockdown, I think for everybody watching, that is such a huge thing. To get lost in the negative, to get lost in the fact that there's things we can't do and we're locked down. Yes, but there are a lot of things you can do. And especially those of you guys who are faith background, church going, that your chance for ministry here is huge. Connect with people, create your own little Zoom small group. There's endless things you can do. And so really appreciate that conversation. Week 2, we kind of jumped into something that's really, really big here locally at least, and that is the misconceptions of Mennonites. And there's a lot of misunderstandings about what a Mennonite is. And so I brought my friend Ann Simons in, and she did a great job explaining that. In our region, at least, I know there's a ton of misconceptions. And so really, really appreciated all the amazing feedback and the conversation we were able to have with that. So thanks for tuning in for questions, all that. So now we're going to switch a little bit. In parts 3 and 4, we're going to deal a little bit more with the mental health aspect of all of this. There's a lot of loss and grief that we faced during this lockdown. During the entire pandemic, and a lot of it is, you have the discussions about finances, you have job losses, you have all that stuff, and then you have the fear of getting sick, and you have knowing people who've passed from COVID, but then there's also all of the grief and loss that we've faced that you can't put a price tag to. It's missed birthday parties, it's missed Christmas gatherings, it's missed celebrations. For a lot of people, it was they're missing everything that grade 12 was supposed to happen. That senior year, missing all those events. It's those missing college. It's a year on your apprenticeship. It's all those missed opportunities, those missed moments. And so there's a lot of things we've lost over the last year. And not a lot of the conversation that we're hearing, at least, is really talking about the mental health part of it. Because one day we're going to come out of this. We certainly believe it, and this is going to be a story that we're going to tell to our kids and our grandkids. And when we do, we want to come out of it not just physically healthy, and that's important, the mass and all those arguments, that's important conversation, but there's also the mental piece. We want to come out of it mentally healthy. And as a culture prior to COVID, we already struggled to have this conversation. It's why a day like Bell's Let's Talk, which is coming up again at the end of this month, why that's such a big deal, just the very basics of we need to talk about this. People are struggling and we hide this. And so long before COVID, we were already trying to hide this. And so we're going to open up this conversation. Today we're going to talk about grief and loss. Next week we're going to talk about stress and anxiety. And so that is where we are heading. So without further ado, I want to introduce a friend of mine to you, Jason Dykstra. Hey, thanks so much for joining us and being here with us. Why don't you start a little bit? I always think it's important to understand who we're talking to. Now, I know a little bit about you. Most people have probably never met you?
Likely.
Likely?
Most people have probably never heard of me.
So tell me a little bit about who you are, kind of what you do, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so my name is Jason Dykstra, and what do I do? That's changed so much, especially in the last number of months and years and everything. One of the things I do very often, especially right now, is I'm a parent, which brings a whole different level of mental health into all of this, especially going into a second lockdown and teaching kids and, trying to make your time scheduler all of a sudden, and a part-time chef, and trying to keep the little.
By part-time, is that like every other day kind of thing?
No,
All right, kids,
no.
you're on your own today.
Yeah. Maybe a new rule we should start, actually.
No kidding. You're like 6. Go home, cook.
Yeah, you're good. You're good. So yeah, I'm a parent, a husband, a father, all those fun things. In my work life, for the last 10 years or so, I've worked in conflict management as well as leadership development, working with churches, faith-based communities, as well as organizations. Throughout that journey, I've had the opportunity to talk a lot about mental health as well as grief, especially through just my own experiences.
So yeah, we actually met. You were teaching mental health first aid, and so we were joking beforehand that we took the course and realized that we all need a lot of help. So really cool course. If you've never heard of it, mental health first aid I found incredibly insightful. There's quite a few really good takeaways I took away from that, and so something to look into. So one of the things that we've talked about going into this with grief is the fact that we struggle to admit that we're struggling.
Yeah.
So we've talked about that a little bit.
Yeah.
This pandemic specifically, we have struggled to. It seems so wrong to feel like we're missing out, right? There's all those Facebook posts and all that that'll be like, well, at least you didn't have to go to war. At least you didn't have to this. And so somehow we try to minimize each other's grief.
Yeah.
Right? Well, at least it's not this. At least it's not that. So before we get into your post, which I want to talk about this morning too, but tell me a little bit about your story of grief. So you talk about, where we actually connected about this topic was the fact that you blog a lot about grief.
Yeah.
And so you've had a pretty intense journey. And so before we get into some of the details of how we grieve and stuff, talk to us a little bit about what your journey has been like, and maybe some of the things that you as a family have learned through that.
Yeah. So I come at grief less from an academic standpoint and more from just personal experience. Just over 4 years ago, we were expecting our third child. We had 2 others at home, a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
She's turned 7, which is pretty exciting. And so she's decided she's going to expand her birthday into today and tomorrow, maybe into Tuesday as well, which, I mean, I can't blame her.
Right. If I don't get a party, I'm getting a longer celebration. Right?
Exactly. We had 2 kids at the time. We were expecting our third, and everything in the pregnancy, just seemed to be normal, I guess. Our third child was overdue, which is similar to our first 2 as well. Apparently my wife has a comfortable womb, and they just love to hang out there. And so we were kind of getting ready to do that whole induction process again. And all of a sudden one day I got a text message. I was at a leadership conference that day, and the text basically said, stand by your phone. I think I'm having contractions, and you may have to come home. And sure enough, a little bit later, I got a text message from her to come home. Now's the time. This is happening. And so I swooped in to home like some sort of superhero, and gathered up the kids, brought them off to my in-laws and everything like that. Came home, and our midwives had shown up. And our midwives took out one of those Doppler scanners, and I was searching for a heartbeat, and they couldn't find one. And they said, it's probably just this actual machine, wait for the other midwife to come. And the other midwife came, and they still couldn't find one. And so we rushed to the hospital, where not even 10 minutes later, our third son was born. But he was born into the hands of God. And that was rough. Like that sucked. And, a couple of days later, we're standing, that was a Friday, August 12th, 2016. 2 days later, on the Sunday, we're standing at a funeral for our son. With some close family and friends around, and just didn't see it coming. at all.
Right.
All the signs were pointing that this was going to be a healthy child. And in that moment where there was supposed to be, just cries and joys and
Right.
all of that, it was just this silence. And a couple of months later, I started writing about this journey, and mainly as a way to kind of for me to process it. For some reason or another, I decided to make those processing more public. Well, some of those writings more public. It just kind of this community kind of came around it. And when I was going through my own journey of grief, I was, scouring the internet as one does, and just realizing how much, just that there's not much out there, especially around pregnancy loss, or especially around stillbirths. And it's something that happens at like 1 in 4 couples experience miscarriage. 6 out of every 100,000, 6 out of every 1,000, and in stillbirth, right? That's, with just our birth totals in a year, just stillbirths alone, that's over 2,000 couples that are experiencing this every single year. And a couple months later, we found out that we were pregnant again. It's this experience that of holding joy and just intense fear and anxiety. And I thought I was dealing with it really well. Here I am, I'm writing about it and all of this kind of stuff and thinking, I got a pretty good handle on this whole grief thing. And then in July, our fourth child was born in August as well, almost a year later than Ezra. I thought I was dealing with it really well, and then we went up north, and I had this like pain in my back, and it started under my arms, and I was like, oh, maybe I switched deodorants or something. I don't know, right? I mean, things that you think you would know, but you just second guess yourself, I guess. And I ended up with shingles across my back. And for me, it was just this reminder of you're not doing good. Like you're holding a lot of stuff right now. And you're not actually journeying through it at this point. Through years of therapy now, and talking with spiritual guidance and a therapist, just come to realize how much we don't actually talk about grief and loss and some of the things that are really troubling us. And I think that's true of all people, men especially, that we'd like, we'll just stuff that down. Right. We don't need to revisit this. We don't need to, it's good. We'll just keep moving on. And sooner or later it gets you.
So one of the things that I found really interesting in learning about grief and trauma and any of that, so we took a couple of years ago through the fire department, I got sent off to take a course on learning to be a part of a critical incident stress management, right? And so you're thinking about all these complex things, about how to help people along and everything. And it's so interesting the amount of value that all the teaching places on just sharing that story. And I feel like that's one of the basic things that we've really tried to model, and part of why, I'm asking Jason to share, in front of all of us, part of your grief. Tim and Sam, if you guys watched the video, Tim and Sam shared theirs. If you've been part of our church throughout December, we shared a bunch of joy stories, because there's so much power in being able to share that story. Now, that's not the end of it. I mean, just sharing your story alone doesn't change it. But there's so much value in doing that. And for some reason, in the culture that we have, we seem to look down on it. And I know from a first responder sense, through the years, it's changed so much. And so much that our mental health conversation has become so healthy. But we have a long way to go. But I remember when you first got on, if you were struggling with something, especially as a man, I mean, you should never be struggling. In a case like this, it sounds crude, but if you go back 20 years and you tell your buddies you're struggling with this, they're going to tell you to man up. Yeah. Like, this is ridiculous. This is embarrassing. What are you doing? Yeah. Why are you writing those blogs? Yeah. Like, that's right. And so there's so much of that we bottled in, but then the effects took place in things like alcoholism rates and
Yeah.
anxiety and in depression because you can't bring any of this. You can't admit this to anyone, so what do? Well, you suffer alone.
Yeah.
And humans are not created to suffer alone. We don't struggle alone. That's why a lockdown is so incredibly difficult for us to deal with. We don't do well by ourselves.
Yeah.
And I read something the other day, somebody was saying, well, I mean, we live in a world of Netflix. This is all first world problems. But when it comes to isolation and when it comes to suffering alone,
Yeah.
there's no such thing. Like, Netflix is not your friends. Netflix is not companionship.
Yeah.
And, when I think back, with Tim and Sam's story, one of the things that I struggled with so much was, so I go there and I officiate this funeral. Well, a good, loving person would do what? Well, you would hug and you would care and you would hold. And then they have these rules that say that you can't.
It's so hard.
And at that time, we were dealing with, we are still to this day, we've built in a culture where there's enough people looking to tattle on people that even at a funeral, you're scared of what you're going to do and so you're sitting there at a distance, and it makes suffering incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And so we go through these incredibly difficult things,
Yeah.
but then also feel like you have to do it alone. And I think that's one of the things we really want to model right off the get-go is if you are struggling, you don't have to go through that alone.
Yeah.
One of the reasons we as staff try to be as vulnerable as we do, and we ask our guests to be as vulnerable, because every one of us struggles. The statistics you were giving about struggles in pregnancy, well, when you're the only one in your little small circle that's had those struggles, you feel incredibly alone. And I know in our church there are many couples who have been unable to have kids, who have struggled for years with this. And where do you go with that? Yeah. And so we need to have that conversation because you're not alone. Whatever you're struggling with this morning, whatever grief or loss you're facing, you're not the only one. But it's hard for us to admit that.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, it's important to model that too, right? This idea of sharing, this idea of being vulnerable. I remember it was probably about 6 months after we lost Ezra. We're sitting around the supper table. We're having dinner with our two living children, and my oldest son. There's just tons of tears in the house and everything like that. And my oldest son, we're sitting there eating, and he goes, "Yeah, I'm not sure if." I think Dad is the least sad out of all of us, because it's a competition, of course.
Right.
But I think Dad is the least sad out of all of us because he never actually cries about Ezra. And if you could get punched in the gut, just right. All the breath just got taken away. And I was like, oh, so I'm grieving privately. I'm grieving in the bathroom, in the shower, when I'm out in the car going to work or whatnot.
Was he not reading your blogs?
He was not. No. Yeah, no. We'll have to correct that. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not actually modeling for him about sharing what's going on for me, right? And that, this is really difficult. Right. And there's something about that community, right? Mm-hmm. That when we have the opportunity to be able to share whatever it is that's going on for us, regardless of what that is, there's that chance that someone on the other side is going to say, yeah, me too. Yeah, I'm struggling with that too, right? I came up, I found an old friend shortly after we lost Ezra, and he just said, hey, welcome to the club. It's a club that no one wants to be in, but I'm sure glad that it exists, right? And it was just this idea of, I'm not the only person experiencing this.
Well, and it's that way I've noticed during this time too, as you're in isolation or lockdown or whatever, marriages are struggling, you're struggling to parent, and so often with basic things like that, right? How do you navigate? Well, I'm the only dad who screwed this up. I'm the only, you need to talk to somebody else because you're not. Yeah. And it's not like it makes it better, but then at least you can lean on. I think there's also a leaning part and a learning part where when if there's a club, a terrible word for something like that, but what other word do you use? Yeah. So club, there's got to be somebody who's gone through this before. So how did you navigate that with young kids? Yeah. How did you navigate this journey with your next child? Because that has to have been fairly terrifying leading into the birth, between you and your wife. I mean, that's an anxiety that probably it doesn't go away. So, let's get into a little bit of actually what grief looks like and how we go through that. So you wrote a blog this morning and sent it out. And so I want to touch on something in there real quick. You talked about how that grief, which is now 4 years-ish old, really helped prepare you for COVID. And one of the things that stood out to me, and I'll let you highlight anything else you want to highlight, but you talked about the words "at least" and how those words were thrown at you often while you were grieving and the impact that had. So talk to us a bit more about that, and then we'll jump into more specifically how we deal with grief.
Yeah, I think those are words that we use a lot. At least, one of the ones that we got often was, at least you have 2 other children, right? As if that somehow negates all those feelings that you're feeling, right? And we say it all the time, at least you have a marriage. Oh, right. At least, you have another child that's doing well in school while the other one is, at least you are younger and you can have more children. And I think one of the things that does is it brings so much stigma into the conversation, right? And when you're hearing those things, it's like, why can't I be? I have 2 other children at home. We have another baby on the way. There's a lot of people that can't have kids. I should be super grateful for this. And I think we have a bit of a culture, this kind of happiness culture, right? Of regardless of what's going on in your life, just be happy.
Right.
Forget all the rest, just shove it under the carpet. And there's so much happiness around us. There's so many things to be grateful for. And it's true, there is so much things to be grateful for. And joy and sadness can exist at the same time. Loss and love can exist at the same time, right? Gratitude and just being defeated can live at the same time. And it's not one thing or the other. And I think one of the things that we do so often, we just shove it under the carpet, right? One of the things I used to tell a lot of my conflict clients was, you can shove that conflict and those disagreements under the carpet, but sooner or later you're going to be sitting with a mountain in your living room. And I think we do it all the time with some of the things that we're experiencing. Just shove it down. Ooh, that comment really hurt. Shove it under the rug, right? I can't go see my family or my friends right now. Shove it under the rug, right? Maybe I'm not talented enough or smart enough or good looking enough or whatever it is. Just shove it under the rug, right? And sooner or later we're sitting there, enjoying our, craft coffee or whatever in our living room, and we're staring at this mountain that's going on. And so just by ignoring it doesn't make it no longer exist. It's still there, and I think in so many different ways, by not addressing it, by not sitting with it, it causes more pain and just kind of, avalanches almost.
Well, and that's very similar to the theory on trauma, because they always talk about trauma being kind of like a shelf.
Mm-hmm.
And every shelf has the capacity to handle a different amount of trauma.
Yeah.
But when that shelf collapses,
yeah,
that's where you get your major PTSD and you get some of these major disorders. Now, given everybody's threshold is different, but the one thing that is in common between all of it is you can't just ignore it.
Yeah.
It's not just going to go away just because of time. It may get easier to handle. And some people, if their shelf is strong enough, whatever that thing is, if you're built with enough resilience, I guess, you see people, they go through their life and you go, how did you get through that? Yeah. And they just did. But not everybody's there. And whether it's the mountain in the living room, whether it's that shelf, whatever that is, we can't just ignore that. But I like what you said in there, because I've seen this happen in a lot of conversations, and I think I do this in a lot of conversations. You always know there's somebody who's struggling more.
Right.
And so then you almost begin to feel guilty about the fact that you're even struggling. And so I remember there's a good friend of mine in the church, and you guys would know who I'm talking about, but has incredible back pain and has had for years. And every time you talk to him about it, he's like, wow, there's people who have worse. Yeah, but you're suffering.
Yeah.
But there's almost this stigma attached to that I mean, I don't know who has the worst. I don't know how you get to being classified as the worst case. Yeah. But it almost seems like we can never actually allow ourselves to grieve because there's a stigma to say, but you have all this other stuff. So that kind of leads me into this question. So in your story, so for people who are listening who have gone through loss and grief and hurt, what did you learn? And I want to ask it in 2 separate different ways. And again, I didn't tell them I was asking these questions. We're going on the fly here. So,
what you got?
So what did you learn about grieving well. So you've talked about writing, you've talked about expression, you've talked about counseling and stuff, but what was that journey personally like? And then the second question I want to ask about is, how do you journey that in a marriage? Because statistically, the loss of a child and divorce are incredibly highly connected, which just tells you the amount of grief that something like that causes.
Yeah.
So if you could address kind of what did you personally do? What are some of the things that you've learned? And then if we could talk into what does that look like from a husband and wife standpoint? How do you navigate through that?
Yeah. So for me, I acted as I typically do and kind of just shoved it down, especially at first. If you've ever had any type of major life event that has happened in your life or in your family, you know that often one person kind of becomes the spokesperson for the family to handle all public relations kind of inquiries of, the greater public. So I quickly jumped into that role. And so, I was the face when the flower delivery guy came a couple times a day. Got to know him really well. Tim, hi. But you become that public face. And so I ended up very quickly almost detaching myself from everything. And so someone would come up and, when you're expecting a baby, you tell everybody. Like our local gas attendant knew we were, having a baby, and everyone. And so when you don't see them or anything along those lines, what's the first question? Oh, do you guys have a baby yet? Right? And so, I quickly found a way to almost detach myself emotionally from it. And so that it was this weird out-of-body experience where I could see myself explaining to that person who was asking, oh, this is what happened. Yes, this is how my wife is doing. This is how the other kids are doing, and so on and so forth. And I could almost just watch my body going through this entire pitch, essentially. Started to realize, I'm not actually grieving. I'm not actually dealing with this. I'm not actually, I'm very detached from this. It was that one of the things that really opened up that can of worms for me was the story I was telling about my son, who was like, oh yeah, dad's the least sad out of all of us. That I realized, I've detached myself so much. I'm trying to shove this under the carpet and not deal with it. Another thing that happened was a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, came over and he said, oh, how are you doing? And so I went through my pitch like I usually do, the updated 2.1 version. And, this is how they're doing today, and so on and so forth. And he said, how are you doing? I said, I'm doing fine. He said, how are you really doing? And I was like, just broke down. And one of the things that I think really helped me, and I mean, this was not in the early days, but in the early days, you're just trying to survive. Do whatever you need to do. You take it moment by moment, day by day. And that's one of the things that my wife and I used to say to each other all the time was, hour by hour, minute by minute. Don't even think about tomorrow right now. Let's just get through the next minute. And then let's get through, maybe an hour. And maybe, eventually let's just get through the day. And one of the things I started to learn to do, part of it through writing, part of that through talking with a counselor, part of that talking with friends and leading on our community, was really just, how do we sit with it? How do we sit with this stuff that's coming up? I heard a quote from James Finley once, who's like a Christian mystic, and he was talking about, before we go into the deep end, we need to learn how to float in the shallow end. Because when we're in the shallow end, then we all of a sudden get roughed up a bit, we can at least put our foot down and reground ourselves. But once we learn how to float in the shallow end, we can start moving out into the deep end, which is where all the pain exists, which is where all the true meaningful things exist. And once we learn how to float, then even when we're in that deep end and we start getting scared, we start feeling lost, all those things start raising up for us, then we know that we can ground ourselves by coming back to a float, re-energizing, recharging ourselves, finding those roots, that center, before we kind of dive back into it, because that's where the real work is. And so I think the only way to get over pain or to deal with grief is to go through it. And in the early days, that's terrible advice, right? I mean, because we're already so much in the middle of it, and it's going to look different for every single person. I think that's part of the difficulty, is that some people will deal with it doing X and Y and Z and all the way through. For me, dealing with it at the time was not dealing with it. And in short little bursts, whenever it felt safe to do so, kind of starting to process some of those things.
So I'm curious here. One of the things that we have seen in people over time is the busyness of our culture and the effect it has on grief, because you can basically make yourself busy enough that you feel like you're grieving well.
Yeah.
But I mean, I love the illustration there of floating in the deep end, but you can't get to the deep end if you never allow your brain to even think through any of this stuff.
Yeah.
Right. And so when you think about even the stages of grief, that initial one is that denial piece. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that's where a lot of us just stop. Mm-hmm. Because to think about it and to go into the deep is so incredibly hard. And so I'm guessing, at least I'm going to assume here, but your writing was part of you taking enough time to process that.
Yeah.
Are there other things that you worked for you or that you've seen in other people where, how do you pause long enough to get there?
Yeah. Yeah, I think sometimes it's that like I'm not kind of a 2x4 guy, and what I mean by that is usually God takes a few smacks at me with a 2x4 and says, kind of like, listen up, like I'm talking to you, like slow down, right? And for me, it was the ability to be able to slow down within that. I mean, one was those shingles that I was talking to you about, right? Where to me it just felt like God was saying, dude, you need to slow down. And me saying, I got this, I'm good. I'm just going to keep going. I have this packed calendar. I have this business I'm running. I'm, traveling 60, 70,000 kilometers a year, like driving everywhere. My calendar's full, and that's good because that makes me feel valued. Look at all the people that need my advice or need to sit with me and blah, 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 right? And then, God takes out that 2x4 and he kind of says, no, you need to slow it down, right? I'm just thinking of in Exodus, I think it's Exodus 14, if I'm not mistaken. Moses leads the Israelites out of Egypt. The plagues worked. This is wonderful. It's great. We're free. We're gone. And all of a sudden they get to the Red Sea, right? And all of a sudden Pharaoh's army's coming down on them, and they're like literally trapped between a rock and a hard place, right? They have all these like cliffs and like all that, the rocks and the mountains and stuff like that. They have the Red Sea, and then there's Pharaoh's people coming in, right? And what's the first thing that the Israelites do? It's like, oh, Moses, why did you take us here to die? Like, we would have been better to die as slaves in Egypt and blah, blah, blah. And Moses says to him, the Lord, your God, is fighting for you. You just need to be still. And in some translations, it says, you just need to shut your mouth, which is kind of my style. And for me, it was slowing down did not begin as a choice. In some ways, it was definitely forced upon me. And it was just starting to pay attention to some of those different things. So writing has been a big thing for me that just helps me to slow down, to be able to sit with it while it's safe to do so. I know for others, I have friends that are more mechanically inclined than I, and for them, it's almost a meditation practice, just working on a vehicle. And that helps them to be alone with their thoughts and process whatever is going on for them. For some, it's, sitting in that backyard at a safe distance nowadays, and just having those conversations with friends and family that make them feel like they're in a safe place. For others, it's, sometimes doing things, right? Going for those walks, going for, working in the garden, whatever that might be. And I think everyone processes things so differently. And so writing has been a big thing for me. Music has been a big thing for me. Just sitting still, letting lyrics wash over me, and seeing how they speak to me, and things along those lines.
Well, I think one of the things when we're going through this stuff that I'd really encourage you is not to compare how you're responding to how others are. One of the things that we learn in dealing with critical incidents is that everybody's going to respond differently to the same situation. Mm-hmm. And so when you talk to 40 first responders that are on a scene, 2 of them it may affect in a dramatic way. 20 maybe nothing, and then 18 are who knows why. But everybody responds differently because you're facing situations that are so unpredictable. And your own circumstance is so unique that I think there's that too. And I'm more of I'm a crybaby that way. I cry easily. I cry during sad movies and commercials. So that already is going to be my response. I'm emotional. And I've always been. Yeah. My parents let me know that I was like this as a child, right? So, but that's just mine. And I think sometimes you mentioned the idea of the working on a car. Well, some guy goes, well, I should be writing out my feelings. Well, maybe not. Maybe you should be working on a car because that's what works for you in allowing yourself the freedom to grieve as you do. Yeah. And if it doesn't bother you, don't pretend it does. But grieve through it the way you're grieving. It's individual, and there isn't a right or a wrong. There's just, this is going to be my response. I know for me there was a ton of calls that didn't affect me, and then all of a sudden one that I didn't think would have affected me really affected me. Yeah. Well, I can't control that. Yeah. And so you just keep navigating and going, okay, well, this is how I'm feeling right now, and this is how I deal with it. But I don't need to compare myself to Jason. I don't need to compare myself to Dimitri or Patrick or to anybody else or to how another family did it. I think when you allow God to just kind of now work through you, you work it out, whether that's out in the woods, whether that's writing, whatever that is. Yeah. I think there's so much peace and freedom in that. So let me ask you specifically about marriage. Because marriage is hot.
I have one.
Yes, but that's good. That's really good.
Yes.
Congratulations. And you guys are a dual income home, and so it's busy and it's chaotic, and you have kids. I know there's not a short, very simple answer to this, but what did that grieving process look like in that context? How did you and your wife work through this and stay together through this?
Yeah, one of the biggest things I think that we did, and it was not at my insistence, that's for sure, was a question that we would ask each other every single night. We'd sit out on the back deck, or whether we were sitting in the house or wherever. Is a question that I can't take any credit for. My wife is the one that came up with it, and the question was just as simple as, "How's your heart today?" And to be perfectly honest, I hated that question, especially at the beginning. Like, I don't want to tell you about this. I don't want to talk about this. I don't want to unlock that box right now. My wife is a pretty incredible person and very patient, and kept at it and asked that question every single night, to the point where I was getting comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And I think that communication is one of the biggest things. We're all going to grieve differently. My wife's journey is very different than mine, and I'm very cognizant whenever I'm speaking about our journey with Ezra that I'm talking out of my experience, not hers. Because we grieve very differently. And so to be able to communicate back and forth with that, and that means, often closing our mouths, listening for what that person is saying, and not trying to fix it. I think we jump into that fixing so quickly. And I know I'm the kind of person that, bring all your concerns to me and I will try and help you fix it. And I've had to learn over the years that that's not actually fixing anything. Right. That person knows what they need. They know what's going on for them, and they need a listening ear that way. And so that question changed absolutely everything for us. How's your heart doing? And just that check-in with one another of, how are you doing? I'm going to sit here, I'm going to listen to you, and then we're going to switch. Okay. And I'm not going to give you any answers. I'm not going to, maybe you should try yoga for the 15th time or whatever that might be. And maybe those are great suggestions. Yeah. However, I'm just going to be present in that moment and I'm going to witness your suffering. Yeah. And it's not a competition like you're talking about, right? I think, we compare our griefs or our tragedies or our chips on our shoulders with our spouse, with our family members, with people at large. And it's not a competition. Right. There is no hierarchy of grief. The worst grief that you're ever facing is the one that you're currently experiencing. And that's enough. Yeah. And so, it's easy to say, you've been to how many different accidents and seen all of these different things, or, so-and-so has dealt with cancer and they've lost their partner and they've lost a child and they've lost, all of these different things. Their grief is going to look different than your grief. It's going to look different than my grief. It's going to look different than my wife's grief. And all of them are painful, all in different ways, in their own ways. And at the time, it's whatever one that you're dealing with is the worst one.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit. A question came in that I liked, and I think it'll transition us well. They ask, can you talk about long-standing grief? How grief doesn't end and can change over time. And so that we were going to talk on a timeline of grief, and because there's almost, especially in a marriage, I can see this playing out where one grieves longer than the other. Right? And again, it's this comparison game. And I'd like to say that, it's easy, just don't compare, but it's really hard not to compare. Right? When
we're still human.
Right. When you're the one telling the same story again, because everybody else has moved on. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about that listening to Tim and Sam as they shared their story, that everybody else had moved on. They didn't intentionally. It's not that they had forgotten, but they weren't grieving the way Tim and Sam were grieving. And so we have a tendency to move on. And so when you ask them, you're like, oh, you're still there. But that grief doesn't just go away, especially when it comes to the loss of life, because those you don't ever forget. You don't forget somebody that you've lost. So what have you learned? And I mean, you're 4 years into it, which is already a long time, but I mean, we're not a lifelong, but I know you've looked into it quite a bit. What have you learned about the timeline of grief? And then maybe end that question with some pointers. How do you deal with long-standing grief? Yeah. When you're 10 years in, what are some of the things that you've learned?
One of the things that I've learned so far, and I mean, I'm only 4 years into this, and so it's kind of a drop in the bucket compared to other people that have, longer standing grief. But one of the things that I've learned is I will continue to grieve as long as I've loved. And I think we're very quick to put a timeline on it. After 2 weeks, you should be here. After 3 months, you should be here. Definitely within a year, you should be back to work. Or whatever that is, right? And it's going to look different in every single community. I come from the Dutch community, for better or worse, and we seem to have a bit of this motto of, you keep going, you don't stop, right? And so that's, how I was raised in a lot of ways of, oh, you're a little sick today? Oh, that's really too bad. You should probably, grab some Kleenex and go to work. Oh, you fell down? Oh, you better get up and you better walk that off, right? We're very quick to kind of go on to the next thing. Okay, when can we kind of tie a neat little bow around this grief, and when are we allowed to move on again? Right. And I think I've seen these things where, there's a circle and this is your life, and then grief enters it, and then there's another circle and it's, just the same size. And then we always show this grief getting smaller and smaller and smaller while that circle kind of stays the same. And I think it's a bit of a misrepresentation of how grief works. I think instead of that grief getting smaller, our lives just expand around it. And so that grief doesn't actually get less. We get better at dealing with it, for sure. But there are still moments that I have that all of a sudden I'll be watching this movie, or, I'll hear a story like Tim and Samantha, and I'm just bawling. And it's not about them. It's, that my own loss kind of coming up, and it's everything about them, right? And grief is super inconvenient. It just shows up at the most inconvenient times often. And One of the biggest things I think I've learned in terms of timeline is there's no right timeline. Some people will, get over it easier, but I mean, you never get over it. You just deal with it in different ways.
Well, and again, a lot of it will depend on different triggers, right? You may be doing fine for 10 years until a friend goes through it or something else happens. And so I think, in general, this is something that we navigate the rest of our lives.
Yeah.
And that certainly has been my experience, where it's little things.
Yeah.
And you see something and you're triggered back to something else.
Yeah.
And I think, like you said, you get better at dealing. And I think that's just the reality. Like, you get better at you're not forgetting, you're not trying to push it away, you're not doing any of that, but you get better at bouncing back. Because I think in the early days especially, like, this takes you out for days on end.
Oh, yeah.
And you get to a place where it may only be a few moments, but then sometimes it is a day. And I think it depends on what's going on. You may get really good and then you lose a parent, or whatever that happens. I read a quote, so I've been reading a book, a lady who lost her husband to suicide, and it's her journey through that. And she writes a lot about grief, and she said, the consequence of love is grief. Every time we love, we risk grief. And I think that's so much of it, that every time now when you're loving your other kids, every Christmas, Ezra's still there. It's a part of that. And you learn how to still live, and that's what I love. I've never thought of that before, but that idea of life expanding around the grief. Because actually in this book, she used that illustration too. And I thought, and I'm like, but that makes a lot, because it doesn't go away. And it shouldn't, because you love. I mean, and I think Jesus modeled this. I mean, Jesus, knowing where people go after they die, knowing all the questions that we don't have answers to, he had 100% sure answers to, right? He lost a friend and he still mourned deeply. And I think that speaks volumes to the level of grief that we experience when we have love. And when you have a kid or when you have a friend that dies, that kind of grief you can't put a timeline on.
You can't.
I know we always talk about, and I know counseling has gotten a bit of a real men don't need counseling type of stigma around it. But I really think some of these situations that people have gone through, like, go talk to somebody. Go, if you can't find somebody around you, and if you're really, really struggling deeply after a couple of months still, maybe somebody else can help walk you through it. Because there are, man, some of the stories we have in our church family, like, they're devastating. And you don't just wake up the next day and forget that your dad is dead. You don't forget that, your child is dead. You don't forget these things. And even when it comes to trauma, and you think about sexual assault or any of those types of things, these are all things that you grieve. You grieve loss. You grieve all that. And so to put a specific timeline on it is inaccurate. But I think there is also a piece where, man, I wish, just dive into as much healing as you can. Don't hold back. Don't let the stigma get you. Dive into, try counseling. And if that doesn't work, then try something else. Then try something else. But keep fighting for life. And that's one of the things I really liked about reading the book. And I cannot remember the name of it for the life of me right now. But just this, when someone that close to you dies, and especially dying by suicide, it can strip your whole life. And the choice she made to just keep fighting for life. And I think that's one of the things I would so much believe why we need community and why these conversations, because we want to keep fighting for life.
Well, and it's important to, like, there's so much, I think because there is so much stigma around grief, then there's so much self-stigma as well. And so I remember the first time I laughed again after Ezra, and I almost felt guilty. And I was like, how in the world can I experience this joy still? Right? And sooner or later, I think you realize that, love and loss, they can coincide. Joy and grief, joy and hard times, joy and absolute despair. They can be one and the same moment so often. Grief, it changes your entire life. Right? All of a sudden you become more self-confident. You lose that self-confidence. It changes your friendship. You are exhausted all the time. And you get better at it. What you're saying, you wake up every day and you're choosing life. Maybe today is a little bit better, maybe it's a little bit worse, but we've made it through this day. right? And I think it's so important to talk about these things, regardless of gender,
Right.
to talk these things.
100%.
I think men specifically
Yep.
really need to be encouraged to talk about these things. I mean, men are at a 3 times greater likelihood of suicide than women.
Yep.
Part of that is because of social isolation,
Yep.
that we take all these feelings and these thoughts and what's going on, and we just throw them under that carpet. We throw them in the toolbox. We throw them wherever, right? And we just don't bring them out again.
Right.
And they grow.
Right.
And we need to talk about these things. Yeah.
So as we run out of time here, I want to talk a little bit, because one of the things that I have seen in people in our church and people in my circles that I've done life with, somehow, however people feel about God being involved in these things, and there are a lot of questions. Why would God allow? Why would somehow those experiences become these crucial or these pivotal things in our lives that allow us to speak into others in so many more powerful ways. And I've seen it over and over again where, you go through this and you come to the other side and then you realize you're now helping 30, 40 other people come through it.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious, because I know you shared a little bit already. It's been a busy year for you, and you've been asked to speak a lot, which is very interesting for a guy who's very, very sure that he's not a pastor. And everyone keeps asking you to preach, so I'm just going to go ahead and say, if you guys are looking for a pastor. But what has that been like? How have you seen doors open in relationships and in your field of work because you've gone through this and because you've tried to go through it well?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's not a mystery that right now there's a lot of people that are struggling. And, we get into that kind of comparison of griefs and all of that kind of stuff. Honestly, when I first started writing, I was starting to get some messages from people that had lost a job. And they would send me a message and they would be like, hey, I just want to let you know your blog really helped me out. And the first time I was like, you're talking about losing a job. I'm talking about losing a child. Like, these are very different things. And then I got another comment, and then I got another comment. And I've really started to realize grief is grief is grief is grief. And, there is no hierarchy. And so, we're now sitting in basically isolation from one another, and there's things that are going to come up. And I was saying earlier, this lockdown is much harder for me than the first one because I almost know what to expect, right? And I totally forget what your question is, but I think we're all dealing with grief right now, and so that's what was the question. And so when and the question is always, how do we do this well? And I would love to give a script. I would love to say, do this, and you're going to be good. But the reality and the beauty of it is we're all human beings, and we're all going to react differently. We have different needs. And one thing I think that for me just keeps coming back to me time and time again is, regardless of where you're at, regardless of where any of us are at in these journeys, and how much grief is impacting our lives, there's a God that is relentlessly chasing us down. And just like Moses said to the Israelites, the Lord is coming for you. You just need to be still. You just need to surrender and sit with it and let it go. And then, move into your feet and go across the sea. And I think we spring into action so quick that I think it's very important for us to pause before we move into that action, and to sit with that pause. There's something healing about that. That's where the deep water is. That's where the difficult work is. And it's not for the faint of heart. And so creating that safe place for you, whatever that means for you, whether that is a community of people, whether that is, being out in the garden or going for a walk in, God's nature, whatever that looks like for you. Finding a person or two or three or four to be able to have some of those real conversations about how am I really doing, right? It changes everything. It's laying it down at the foot of the cross and watching as God transforms it.
Awesome. All right, we are out of time. Hey, thanks so much for joining us. I really want to encourage you this week to talk about what you're going through, whether that's if you're at home with your kids, whether that's with your spouse, if you are living by yourself, find someone to talk to. This isolation is a challenge. Yes, we live in a first world. Yes, we have a lot of things going for us. All of those things are true. But it does not negate the fact that we are experiencing a very challenging, a difficult time. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of loneliness. And so make sure you check in on your neighbors, check in on the vulnerable around you. If you're listening and you'd like to share your story with somebody and you're not sure who, send us a message. We'd love to sit with you and chat. We can do Zoom. We can do whatever technology works, a phone call, to make sure that you're not going through this alone. Because this will end. And I firmly believe this will come to an end. And this is a story we will tell. And when we get to the other side, we want to be healthy so we can get on and keep enjoying our lives. And so with that, thanks again, Jason.
Thank you.
If you would do us the honor of closing us off in prayer.
Sure, I would love to.
Appreciate that.
God, we just come before you this morning absolutely in wonder of all that you have made and just the beauty of all of it and how broken it is and we are. And Lord, that we know that it's you that makes us whole again. And so, Lord, I just ask that you give us the courage and the protection and the vulnerability and the ability to just lay down whatever those struggles are at your feet so that you can just rain your unending grace and love on us. In your name we pray. Amen.
Thanks for joining us. Have a great week.